This is Lucy Innes-Williams. She is a painter, illustrator, and creator of maximalist pattern pieces. Having lived and worked in London's art world for over 8 years, she relocated to Falmouth last year and now lives a stone throw from the beach with her husband James and girls Daisy and Matilda. Since returning to her love of painting 2.5 years ago, she freelances from her home studio, surrounded by a luscious garden which gives her daily inspiration to paint from. Using a combination of gouache, watercolour and Posca pens, she creates brightly coloured, bold and dreamy floral art from which she is creating a growing range of paper products. Her art draws from a broad range of influences, from contemporary painters and illustrators to printmaking, decorative arts, as well as her environment. She particularly enjoys exploring the many tropical gardens Cornwall has to offer and shares in our chat today her current favourites. Alongside her studio practice, she runs occasional painting workshops, takes on commissions, and her work is available for licensing through her agents at Bridgman Studios. Today, I chat with her about her first solo show experience in Falmouth, her love of a good chintzy pattern, and how important it is to intentionally look for inspiration offline. I'm Mel Chadwick. This is Season 2, Episode 4. Welcome to Creative Conversations. I am here with the lovely Lucy in her studio. Welcome, Lucy, to our conversation.
Thank you.
So, tell us a bit about what you do.
So, I am a painter. I wouldn't say I'm just a painter or just an illustrator. I'd say I'm a combination of the two, and I also do quite a lot of surface pattern design.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in patterns and textiles, and so lots of creative things, but I think overall I'd call myself a painter mostly.
So how did you get into painting, and have you been doing it for a long time?
I studied fine art at university.
Yeah. When
I finished that course, I actually felt really disenchanted with painting generally, and I actually stepped away from it for quite a few years. And a lot of my career has been spent working with artists and developing their careers and really working in a very sort of visual focused way for other artists. And during that period of time, and this is a sort of 10-year period, I actually didn't really paint at all, didn't really draw much. I was still a really kind of voracious consumer of images and artwork and exhibitions. I still would love going to exhibitions. I would still say it was a big part of my life. I just wasn't practicing. When I had my first daughter, it was something I started again, and that was only about 2.5 years ago. And it's kind of a confidence thing, building that up again, finding your practice, finding what you want to do, what you're interested in, which media you like. That all takes a while. And so it's really only in the last 2.5 years that I've built that back up again. You know, I feel like things are happening in a really good way now, again, as a sort of more of a trajectory. I feel really happy with where my work is going and excited. Even though I studied quite a lot, well, I studied about, way too long ago to mention. I still feel like I'm an emerging artist because it's really been quite a recent thing.
Yeah.
Being a mother doesn't influence my artwork, and I would never say that that's reflected in my painting. It's more about the change in my lifestyle, the change in my priorities. I guess also I wouldn't say I have more time, because I definitely don't. I definitely have less time, but the structure of my day changed. Something shifted in having children that really made me think I've got to sort of prioritize or focus on things that really make me happy. Painting is one of them, and now it really feels like it's such an important part of my life, and it's almost, without wanting to sound really dramatic, it's a kind of like, it's something I have to do. It's like a compulsion, and it makes me really happy and gives me a sense of purpose and direction, and I absolutely love it.
So what influences are in your work that you do?
I'm definitely influenced by decorative art, decorative textiles, or just textile design generally. I love textiles, particularly 20th century and even earlier actually. I love a heavy sort of chintzy textile, that kind of thing. I'm definitely a maximalist. I'm in no way a minimalist when it comes to anything I do, painting wise. I love bright colours.
Yeah.
I'm definitely quite heavily influenced by colours in a piece when I'm working on something. But then I like to collect artwork by generally other female artists, actually. Because of my last job before moving to Cornwall was in a picture library, and so a lot of my day was spent looking for images that fitted a specific brief, and then talking to the artist about how they might make that image or give us that image to use. And I find that at the time was sort of almost suffocating for my painting. It was almost like image overload. It was something that I couldn't do my work and that at the same time. But because of that, I have a very strong kind of image bank in my mind, if that makes sense, of images and reference points, and sort of in an art historical sense, but also in terms of the contemporary side of things. I love illustration as well, and I think there's contemporary illustration is really interesting at the moment. There are some excellent things happening. I love printmaking, and so my reference points are pretty broad.
Yeah, very broad. But it seems like when you're in, I guess, London, that's where you were kind of immersing yourself in that kind of art world and helping others. And then your move down to Cornwall, it feels like it was because of that complete change and having that space, it then kind of allowed you to do, your own work.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think physical space is part of it, but also mental space as well. We definitely have more space in the house we live in. The room that we're in now is sort of is a studio space, which I didn't have in the same way in London. It sort of suits me to work from home at the moment rather than having an external studio space. But that's something that I feel is quite readily available here, which may not have been the same situation in London. The elements are a really important part of influencing, I think, my mood and my day-to-day, and therefore my work as well. And on a particular day, if the wind is blowing sort of straight onto the beach, you can hear the sea where we are now, and at night you can really sort of see the stars, and so you're very aware of the elements and the weather changing, and the natural world definitely is a big part of all the paintings I do.
You've recently exhibited, didn't you, your first kind of solo show in Falmouth?
The exhibition was called Periwinkle, and I wanted that to be a reference of periwinkle the flower, but also periwinkle, the tiny little shells that you find on the beach. Lots of paintings based on flowers, shells, seaweed. A lot of my work tends to look like textiles, but they're not textile designs. They're paintings, in an end to themselves. They're paintings. They just happen to look like textiles, which I really enjoy, and that is quite purposeful. But a lot of the textiles have borders around them, and they have slightly more graphic patterns in them. And I'd say in the exhibition itself, there were maybe 5 or 6 series of paintings in a quite a sort of colourful way. They kind of, I think they work quite well together, but lots of turquoises, greens, oranges, pinks, but almost exclusively motifs, plants, flowers that have been drawn based on Cornish flowers that I'd seen on walks, trips to the beach. So it was quite a seasonal snapshot, if that makes sense. So it kind of really reflected the summer season and the fact that I'd been doing a lot of the painting sort of in the spring, early summer, in the lead up to the exhibition in August.
Yeah. How long did it take you to actually prepare and plan? When did you start thinking I wanted to put on an exhibition?
I think I spoke to Bianca maybe March.
Yeah. And
in the back of my mind, I was thinking I needed a good few months to focus the work I was making, maybe curate some of the work I'd already done. Yeah. I knew that it wasn't a case for me just putting in every single painting I'd ever done. There were lots of paintings that I made that didn't quite fit the feel of the exhibition, so they weren't in it. So I had a few months to do that, but also just the promotion, the marketing of it, the framing of paintings. There were lots of logistics behind setting the work up itself, because it wasn't, the Huddle isn't a traditional gallery space. So that was a really interesting part of it as well, and that definitely took some time and planning and consideration. And then the associated events that ran alongside the exhibition, so the workshop that you came to, planning all of that. So it took a good few months, but...
Do you think it was really important, though, to have this kind of focus? Do you think that's helped?
Oh, yeah.
You know, with your
really helped.
with your work.
It definitely forced me to kind of keep on painting. It definitely made me more diligent than I would have been. It really made me sort of make the most of every spare kind of hour, day, afternoon when the girls are napping. I really was doing a lot of painting. And it got to a point in around, I think, a month or so before the exhibition opened, just before I took work to the framers. I had a photographer come and photograph the work. Even things like that, a photographer coming made me think, okay, right, well, I've got to finish a new painting by the time they come to, you know, to kind of maximise what you're doing and the efficiency of everything. So I did a lot of painting. I wish I was still painting at that rate. I do actually have an agent that I work with. They are an image licensing company. I give them scanned high resolution images of work that I paint, and those images can then be used for things like book covers. It's quite open-ended how those images can be used. So for me, it's always very important to scan all my images or have them photographed. Yeah. And I always still have my own voice, my own sort of historic voice in my head when I was an artist agent saying, look after your images, document your images, make sure that, you know, you've got your own sort of archive of imagery.
So that is another way, isn't it, that you would, I guess, monetize your artwork?
Yeah. It's a funny thing, being transparent about monetizing your artwork, but I'm definitely at a point in my life where I'm transparent about it and I'm happy to be doing it. And I think that it's quite exciting to feel that there is life beyond the painting itself. Yeah. And what I do with my paintings, other than scanning them and then potentially licensing them, is I create products from them as well. And that's something that I've only really started doing the last 6 months in a way that I'm happy with. Yeah. And I love doing that. It just takes my work in completely different directions. And I still definitely have ambitions for how the work is going to be used in the future. But it's quite nice knowing that someone else is looking after the copyright side of things and the licensing side of things. And then it leaves me a little bit more time to kind of focus on what I want to do, which is painting.
Yeah, well, that is good. And you've got a lovely selection of work, haven't you?
Yeah.
That people can kind of buy, you know, that you've got notebooks and greetings cards.
I've got... Yeah, exactly those things. And they're the kinds of things that I'm interested in buying. And I'm a real kind of paper-based hoarder. I have various different shelves, which my husband and I call walls of worth, which we have, you know, filled with different paper-based goods and things like that, and notice boards. And so I love consuming that from other artists, and it's something I enjoy making. And often, in terms of wanting people to see my work, it's a different audience who might see my work in a stationery shop versus gallery setting. So I'm always trying to think of different audiences. I don't often have products in mind when I make them, but what I do have in mind is collections of paintings. So there are definitely themes in my work that I like to explore through a number of paintings. It might be that motifs crop up again, it might be that certain flowers are in season and I'm really enjoying painting them, so I keep doing it. And it might be that there are certain patterns or graphics in the borders or certain elements that I'm just enjoying, so I use them again and again, and I then sort of will tie together a series of paintings with the colour palette as well.
So let's talk about what paints you use.
So I use a lot of gouache, but it's acrylic gouache. So rather than a traditional gouache, which kind of feels a lot like, well, watercolour really, but with a really nice rich pigment, the acrylic gouache you use is sort of halfway between acrylic and a watercolour, well, a more traditional gouache. It's quite chalky, it dries really quickly, it's quite opaque. I love it because you can layer the colours on top of one another, and by adding water it doesn't reactivate the layer underneath. You can put layers on top of each other really quite quickly and easily and in a nice bold way. And I guess it's the boldness I like. Yeah,
because you also use Posca, is it Posca pens as well?
Yeah, they're essentially like acrylic paint in a tube, but I definitely find that I get quite a different effect by using my hand in a more traditional writing way rather than using a paintbrush. There's a certain amount of extra control you have, even though the actual quality of the paint looks sort of the same. I quite like the texture and the kind of the roughness and the chunkiness of using them, and that it's quite sort of quick and expressive, which I really like.
Yeah, like your work, you seem to have, you can see it's not all smooth, it's not all, flat.
Yeah.
You can see the brush marks, you can see the, where you draw the lines. It's not like you're trying to get a really flat finish.
No, that's not me at all. I love being able to see the process in people's work and in my work, and part of the satisfaction is definitely seeing the artist's hand always. I'm way too messy to ever have things being sort of totally smooth, and that's never really my intention anyway. I feel like it sort of feels a little bit more organic when you can see some of the process. In terms of the process, I like layering up different textures, and then quite often I'll paint something and then I'll almost cancel it out and change the shape of what was underneath and just kind of work into a painting like that.
Yeah. Do you find that you get into a bit of a flow state when you're doing it?
Oh yeah. If I know that I have a really good chunk of time, say 3 or 4 hours, I will just kind of go for it, and I can quite happily paint for that amount of time and just keep going and going and going. If I know that I only have like an hour, for whatever reason, I tend to stick to things like sketching. I don't like starting a body of painting and then having to stop it. Or rather, I like to get to a certain point in the painting without having to stop. Yeah. I feel like it's very difficult to get yourself mentally back into a painting if you've had to sort of drop it, half an hour in. So I'm definitely quite strategic about the types of work I'm doing and when.
And then does that mean you keep sketchbooks?
Drawings. I'd love to say I was one of those people that have like beautiful sketchbooks, and I actually used to when I was at school. I really loved working in sketchbooks. There's something I find about sketchbooks that's quite intimidating, in the sense that there's like instead of acres of blank space, but also I always feel slightly restricted by the book itself. But so I do have some out, and what you'll see is that I've got lots of sketchbooks where I basically just fill in the first few pages and then I'll get distracted. So most often I do work on sheets of paper. Yeah. But because my work is it's sort of reliant upon mood and how I'm feeling on the day to a certain extent when I'm doing studies. Yeah. So sometimes they are studies that will turn into finished pieces, or I'm working on an idea straight onto a nice piece of paper that could actually turn into a painting. So there's something a little bit more freeing I find about working on sheets of paper.
Yeah. But you can see that in your work, it's definitely bold, expressive, and I really like the larger pieces.
Me too.
You just feel like there's more space, it works really well.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting actually, having had an exhibition, just getting a sense of what people liked and didn't like in the exhibition. And that's not to say that sort of feedback is the same as a critique, because it's not. No. It's but it was just interesting to hear what people liked and maybe didn't like so much. And the bigger paintings were definitely really popular, and I really enjoyed doing them. And there's definitely space within the work to breathe. Yeah. I think
that's what it is. There is space, and each element almost has its space as well, rather than feeling like it's got to squeeze into a smaller place.
Actually, you just talking then about balance in the space in a painting is really, really important for me. And in terms of the actual process itself, I'll often draft the shape or draw the shape a lot before I then place it into a painting. I quite often draft out a painting quite loosely by hand, and then I'll sort of paint over it, and then I'll build up the detail. But having drawn it beforehand is what gives me the confidence to be quite bold. And feel confident in the lines and the shapes, making sure to you it feels visually balanced, and there's no one sort of element that's really sticking out or not working or bumping into something else. I spend a lot of time stepping back and thinking about that. Or I know there's a sort of a very traditional artist technique of turning the painting upside down and looking and seeing how it's balanced that way. That really matters to me. Nothing irritates me more than like a motif that just doesn't work, or a flower that doesn't sit right, or it really upsets me. So I definitely think about that a lot.
Yeah, I would say then that you are maybe very closer to pattern making, aren't you?
Yeah. A lot of I used to run a blog focused just on pattern, and I'm really interested in pattern pattern in the natural environment, built environment, patterns that kind of work their way into textile design and stuff like that. And I've actually got it's all wrapped up ready to go, but I'm delivering wrapping paper to a stockist this afternoon.
Oh, lovely.
And that is a design taken from a painting which I worked into a repeat.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing I find very satisfying and enjoyable.
So a lot of your paintings are inspired by gardens.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any particular gardens that you've really enjoyed over summer?
Yeah, any garden where there is sort of a slightly overgrown wild border.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of gardens that are sort of not overly manicured. Lots going on, lots of different levels, lots of different shapes. So Godolphin was a great one. I love Treba.
Yeah.
It's a subtropical garden with beautiful ferns, beautiful sort of covered walkways. At the moment, the hydrangeas, well, I think like a month or so ago, the hydrangeas were looking gorgeous there. The gardens at St Michael's Mount were actually really inspiring.
Oh, wow. Yeah,
It was a trip we made with some friends, and it's not somewhere I would have thought of to go specifically for kind of inspiration for paintings. But actually, again, that was quite a sort of subtropical garden, and it definitely felt like some of the shapes there, they weren't natural to the environment. They'd been sort of placed, but it still worked really nicely.
Yeah.
But my absolute favourite garden, and I have slightly like raved about this and gone on about this probably too much, is a place called the Garden House in Devon. And it's just on the edge of Dartmoor, and there's a sort of formal-ish garden, and then once you walk through that, you go into a wildflower meadow.
Wow.
And obviously, so it's very specific to the time of the year, but it was just so gorgeous. And again, that felt quite sort of abundant and rich, and there were sort of things tumbling over one another, and lots of like gorgeous poppies, and the dahlias were kind of coming into season, and they were going to look gorgeous as well. And it was just so kind of joyful. It was a really joyful garden, so I absolutely loved that. And that visit coincided with doing lots of painting before the exhibition, so it all kind of just came out of me in like a couple of unframed paintings which went into the exhibition, and that happened really quite quickly.
Yeah. Any advice you would give to illustrators or artists, starting out?
Well, I definitely say, and this is something that I said earlier, document your work. Make sure that you have a really clear visual timeline of what you're working on, as much for you as for any commercial interest, so that you can see how your work is changing and developing, monetizing, or giving yourself alternative revenue streams for your work. I think that any artist working today, I think it's a kind of fallacy to think that of the kind of starving artist in a castle idea. I think that you need to be quite realistic and quite practical about surviving and thriving. And one piece of advice I definitely give is to have a website. Make yourself a website. If it's not your skill set, there are loads of websites that you can use that are very cheap and allow you to kind of put your portfolio together. And really, that's all you need. You need a portfolio and a way of contacting the artist.
Yeah.
And that's something I found a lot when I was working as an agent, how many artists didn't have a website. Basically, you don't want to give people barriers to finding you. You want to make it really easy to find you. Another form of inspiration that I think is really important for artists is to go and look at other people's artwork. Don't be afraid to draw inspiration from the visual world around you. I think that going to galleries and seeing what's out there is so important and so inspiring. So keep doing that. And don't just look on Instagram, and also don't derive your sense of self-worth, particularly when it comes to your paintings, from Instagram or from Instagram likes, because it's so dangerous and really unhealthy. I've been reading articles. There was a really good article on maybe like a website called It's Nice That, talking exactly about this and how people's likes on posts were really kind of dictating how they were making work.
Yeah. And
how it's not a healthy way to go about things. And I'm all for critique, but face-to-face critique is much healthier than a like on a picture. It's something I'm guilty of myself sometimes, judging a picture based on how people perceive it online.
Yeah.
And it's a tricky one, but my advice would be to stay true to what it is that really makes you happy, and also be sort of confident in developing your own style. Don't paint like someone else, or don't try to paint like someone else, because your work will always be stronger if you kind of stay true to what it is that makes you interested and makes you happy.
What advice would you give to an artist who maybe wants to inject more colour into their work?
I would definitely say that it helps to have an idea of all the colours at your disposal. So before you start a painting, think about the colour palette that you might be using, and maybe paint little swatches of colour. So the colour in your paint pot, the colour in your sort of paint tin is always going to look different than it will on the paper. So maybe paint out a few squares of colour, see how they look together, and then maybe pick a palette. And because my work always looks a little bit like textiles or patterns, I tend to have a palette of maybe 7 or 8 images, and I tend to be fairly restricted. And I think one way of becoming more confident in using colours is to stick to a palette and see what works together, rather than just sort of absolutely overloading a page
all of the
every colour, which can be really overwhelming. And that might be where the sort of fear comes from.
Exactly, yeah. I think that probably is it. You've got so many colours that you don't quite know where to start. But that's a really good tip, actually, just have a smaller colour palette to work with. Where would you like to see your business in a few years' time?
There are sort of 2 directions I'd love to see my work going in, and the first one is to have gallery representation. In terms of my painting, there's not much more that would make me happier than having a gallery to work with and develop a relationship with, and maybe have the guarantee of an exhibition a year and a sort of a goal to work towards, but also just, I suppose, having more people see my work and take my work to a sort of the next level, as it were. I mean, there are galleries that I love, and then there are different sort of galleries that I feel would suit my work, but also I'm realistic that I'm an emerging artist, and so it's kind of trying to figure out the sorts of galleries that I think would work with me. I would absolutely love to see my work used in textile design, and it's something I get told an awful lot, that my work would work on sort of upholstery textiles, even textiles for clothing. So that's something I'd love to explore a bit more. I've sort of started putting feelers out, and I've had a few really interesting conversations from people who work in the industry about giving me some advice, and so I'm really hoping that something like that could come about. I'm potentially looking for a collaboration, but I would just love to work more in that world, in the textile industry world, and because it's where I get a lot of my inspiration, and it's where my work, my paintings, I feel like are sort of shifting naturally anyway. So yeah.
Finally, what would you say to your younger self?
The biggest thing I would say to myself is really to be confident in your style of painting. I think studying fine art and art college, art university generally, can be quite, I was going to say cruel. I don't mean that. I really mean that certain universities have almost a house style, and I think if you're wanting to study fine art, really look at the work of the students coming out of the university and really kind of pick a course that's good for you. I was very focused. This is when I was living in Switzerland, and in my mind England was London, and I refused to look anywhere other than London when it came to studying. And if I could give advice to my younger self again, it would really be to look outside of London, look at all the amazing courses that are perhaps slightly more traditional, vocational, but really have the confidence in what you want to do, and don't let your tutors sort of put you off painting entirely, which is what happened to me for a long time. I would also probably advise myself, not against studying fine art, but I think that if you can combine fine art with something a bit more practical or vocational, such as textile design or illustration design, or even graphic design to a certain extent, it might be a bit more useful or realistic. I don't know. I mean, there's that's just that's the more practical side of the advice.
Yeah. So really, you're just saying be more confident, or be confident in your style.
Yeah, and don't feel. I mean, listen to critiques and enjoy the critiques, but stay true to what it is that's making your work, making you happy in your work, because I think ultimately that's what people look for, and that's what kind of shines out of your work. Anyway,
brilliant. All right, thank you so much
Thank you.
for chatting with us today. And guys, I really hope you enjoyed this really interesting conversation. If you would like to find out more about Lucy, please go and see all of the links. I'll be putting them in the description below. Go and check out her work, go and follow her on Instagram and anywhere else that she is doing her lovely art. And hopefully, guys, I will speak to you again soon. Bye.
Something that's really important to say is don't feel bogged down by concept. if you don't need to or if you don't want to. You know, your work doesn't have to have, or to my mind, you know, work doesn't have to have a deep concept to be moving or beautiful or interesting. It can just be expressive, and there are various different routes into a painting, and it doesn't just have to be about concept, and that's definitely something that I struggled with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As you can see there, it's
Oh wow, yeah. Such a good view though of the garden.
I really want to stay home.
Lovely in the morning for us to get sky.
This morning, did you have a red sky this morning?
This was Creative Conversations, and I'm Mel Chadwick.